Well, for those of you just joining us, you're watching Arirang News election coverage of the South Korea's 20th presidential election tonight. It is underway and we're about 15 minutes away from polls closing and 15 minutes away from the early exit polls coming out. Now, I have guests here who will help me throughout. I have to my right our very own Kim Ji-yeon, and to my left I have Professor Han Shuttle of Yonsei University. Thank you for being here with me. Now, so I'd like to talk about the uniqueness of this very elections. It's been characterized by some as one of the most tightly contested races of ever in South Korea, and not only that, it's been characterized by by a lot of things. But Professor Shuttle, how would you describe this very election?
Well, it's interesting because we've seen this global movement across so many democracies with citizens going toward more outsider candidates. We call it populism. And populism is a tricky term, but it essentially means that it's the public, the masses, revolting somehow against the political elites. And I think in some respects, both candidates this time, even though they're both from establishment, long-term parties here, both of them represent outsiders within those two parties. So it's a change. It's not the mainstream, veteran professional politician type candidates, both of them lawyers. Of course, Jae-myung, being the former mayor of Seongnam, former governor of Gyeonggi-do province. He certainly has the credentials in government, but it's been fairly late in life when he shifted to public office. And then Yoon Suk-yeol, who's, a prosecutor general, high up again in the national government, but not a professional politician. And both candidates have tried to make appeals to voters that are disaffected with the system for different kinds of reasons.
Right. So who are the voters that they're appealing to, especially in this election, Ji-yeon?
Well, there are three key things that I want to point out in this election that I've been eyeing for. One is young voters. There's a staggering amount of young voters of 14.9 million votes. And there's a record high early voter turnout this year, which whether it's good for Jae-myung or Yoon Suk-yeol, that's up for debate. And third, this election is been taking place amid the pandemic. So we'll have to see whether that is a key element in whether Jae-myung or Yoon Suk-yeol will grab the win for this election night. But
right.
Those are the three key things that I'm eyeing for.
Right, absolutely. So young voters, they make up the MZ generation, if you will. They make up a third of the eligible voters this time around. So we'll have to wait and see how they decide on who will be the leader for this country in the next 5 years. And a record high early voter turnout. It was a record ever. So what do you make out of this, really?
Well, I think people do want change, Kan-young. We don't yet know, because we haven't seen the exit polls, what kind of change will be most important to them. But, I have noticed over the past few years that expectations for President Moon were so high in 2017 when he was elected president. People were hoping that he would take steps to curb economic inequality, that, in a sense, life chances for the younger generation would improve during his presidency. Maybe there'd be some sort of breakthrough on the Korean Peninsula with foreign policy. And I think, 4.5 years later, 5 years later, a lot of the younger voters are still waiting for those kinds of changes. For all sorts of reasons that we can discuss, President Moon and the Democratic Party didn't deliver on the kinds of changes young people wanted. So they're looking for change. And the question is, which of the two candidates will be the beneficiary of that quest for change?
That's right. So, and this election being taking place amid a pandemic. Now, do you think that will have any impact on voter turnout?
Well, I think a lot of people have voted earlier this time around, and I'm not really sure if the early turnout being so high is necessarily an indicator of which way the election will go. I mean, we saw this in the United States in 2020 as well. So many people are voting early because you never know with COVID-19 if you're going to get quarantined by surprise. So the last thing people who are planning to vote want to have happen to them is to be sidelined from actually voting because they're suddenly quarantined. I think also some voters just want to avoid crowds. Voters don't want the inconvenience of having to stand in a long line, so if they can avoid that long line perhaps by voting early. Of course, we've seen some lines in the early voting as well. So I think it suggests that the interest is high, the stakes are high. It's hard for us to pin down which way the voters are going to turn out in this election, especially those younger voters, as we've so often talked about. So that suspense, that sense that there's the lack of a clear front runner in this election as well, might be driving the early voting. Votes don't seem wasted this time around.
Absolutely not. It's also been characterized by many things. The merger was one. Also, it's been scandalous, if you will. Ji-yeon, what are some of the most impressive moments during the campaign race? And also, what are some high points and low points?
Well, one of the key points that the dramatic scene is I've witnessed, it was the timing of the coalition between Yoon Suk-yeol and An Chul-soo, the minor center-right People's Party candidate. An, who has served as a lawmaker for 10 years, dropped out on Thursday, the day right before voters were able to cast their ballots in early voting. And, some say that, An has made the final decision for the sake of changing government and for the country, but there has been, reports that he did it for political aspirations that may have, actually pumped the voters up to vote for Jae-myung. So this is one of the dramatic changes that we've ever seen in a presidential campaign of a merger right before the early voting turnout.
Right. The anticipated outcome there was that it would work in favor for Yoon Suk-yeol, but, pundits say that it may have worked in favor for Jae-myung. We'll have to wait and see, until the votes are counted for that. So, this election will go down in history for many, many things, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. Well, we're about 3 minutes away from finding out which candidate has won the hearts of those MZ generation. And what you're seeing on the screen on your left is the Democratic Party of Korea, the Jae-myung campaign headquarters, and on your right, People Power Party Yoon Suk-yeol campaign headquarters. Now, they are also, they have their eyes fixed on their screens in front of them to find out the early exit polls that are set to come out in less than 3 minutes from now. Now, so all the party leaders and the leadership party members are there except for the candidates themselves. And we did hear from our Kim Do-yeon and Lee Kyung-eun that the candidates themselves are at home and they will be making their way to the party headquarters or the campaign headquarters later in the evening for their to congratulate each other or themselves, actually. So these swing voters, who are these swing voters, Ji-yeon?
Well, a staggering 20% of eligible voters are categorized as swing voters, as you mentioned, and local media outlets say they're in their 20s and 30s, and they're going to be the ones determining who's going to be the president for the next 5 years. And together in their 20s and 30s, they account for more than 14.2 million votes this year. And that's slightly lower than that of 5 years ago, which stood at 14.9 million votes. So these young voters, we've talked a little bit earlier, but being a young voter myself, they feel that they're left behind because of rising home prices and the slow wage growth. They're expected to become the decisive force in this election. So these issues were the core. And we have this presidential debates, 4 or 5 of them during the past few weeks, but we aren't really sure whether these candidates, these main contenders have addressed these issues sufficiently. Not being able to have a house after marriage in the Seoul metropolitan area where your jobs and your families and your friends are all residing, it's a public issue. And this kind of frustration, suggests a risk that losing the young vote is larger for E right now rather than Yoon as a representative of the ruling party and the status quo, but that's up for grabs as well. Well, you have to take into consideration an average apartment price here in Seoul. It now costs more than $1 million which has doubled over the past 5 years. And many of the voters might think that the measures taken by the government was accounted for these measures.
Absolutely. So, and we've been hearing that more than ever, there have been undecided voters in the Seoul and the surrounding area. So we'll have to wait and see how these voters have really decided. We're seconds away from the early exit polls being released, and we will be heading to the headquarters. And now we're seeing both campaign headquarters clapping as they see the early exit polls come out. And it is neck and neck, 47.8% for Jae-myung and 48.8% for Yoon Suk-yeol. And that is the KBS, NBC, SBS joint polls jointly done by those three networks in their early exit polls. So we are seeing we are seeing a neck and neck race that is ever so tight. I think the People Power Party had said that they were expecting at least a 5 percentage point difference in the early exit polls. Maybe that is why they seem a teeny tiny bit disappointed, but that is within the margin of error. 47.8% for Jae-myung, 48.8% for People Power Party. However, you need to take into account that the record high early voters, the early voting is not reflected in this number. The more than 880,000 COVID-19 patients and the quarantine, those in quarantine, these numbers are not reflected in the early exit polls. What do you make out of this?
Well, it could be a long night, Kang-young. I mean, I think if we see the two candidates this close, we don't really know yet how those early voters might have come down. We can't really indicate whether the early voters were for Jae-myung or for Yoon Suk-yeol. And the fact also, though, that's interesting is I believe President Moon Jae-in won the 2017 election by a margin of about 17%. So this dead heat that we've now been given in the exit poll, I think that's really showing us that the Democratic Party has had quite a rebuke in a sense. Even if Jae-myung gets in, it might be by the skin of his teeth and not by some sort of overwhelming landslide or mandate. So obviously, we can see right away in the exit polling numbers that voters are looking for change at this time around, a substantial number.
That is absolutely, that is really within a margin of error. That is, in fact, closer than I had anticipated. Jian, so how do you think this ever so tight 0.6 percentage point difference in early exit polls, what do you think that means? I mean, that means we're going to be here all night, that's for sure, but what else?
I want to stick with it's just too early to tell. You said this exit poll does not reflect the early voting this year, and early voting is more than 16 million votes. That's nearly 37% of eligible voters. So you can't really say there's a neck and neck race over there. We haven't counted 37% of registered voters. So I would like to say it's just too early to tell.
It is just too early to tell. Right, so we have, yes, 47.8% and 48.84% by all three networks. So joint polls done by those three networks. Now, so what should we be on the lookout for from here on forth as we see the votes being counted?
Well, it'll be interesting to see if the regions come through in their predictable patterns, if the PPP does well in the southeast part of the country, if they do well in southern Seoul, particularly the districts of Seocho and Gangnam and Songpa, where they typically have their strongholds. If Jae-myung does better than expected in some of these areas, that could spell some good news for the DP. On the other hand, if in the southwest part of the country, I suppose, if the DP candidate Jae-myung doesn't do so well there, that would be a suggestion that voters in a real stronghold for the DP over the years this time around are looking for change.
Right. So they are looking for change, definitely, and this is a very, very close call. Now, how about the voter turnout? How do you think voter turnout will affect the election outcome?
Voter turnout is important, but also I want to first respond to Professor Shuttle that I'm actually looking at a central region of Cheongju right now. It has traditionally been like the election barometer of the 7 presidential candidates so far in South Korean history. It has elected all the winners of all 7 elections since 1987. So this year would be a pivotal in swaying whether it's going for Jae-myung or Yoon Suk-yeol, in my opinion.
Yes, Great. Voter turnout.
Voter turnout, it's a record 75.7% as of 6 p.m. That is a record high, one of the highest in the world, highest in this country.
Right.
And I want to say, 5 years ago, we had this candlelight protest, and then we saw that the power of the people wanted to have a change. They know that they recognize that they have this power to change the government if it's not do fit. So I think this 75.7%, it's a continuation of that feeling of the power that you have your right to vote and you have your right to say in whether the government is on the right track. And the election results will figure it out later tonight.
Right. Let's now head over back to our campaign headquarters, where our campaign correspondents are standing by after the early exit polls have been announced. First, let's go over to our Kim Do-yeon, who is at the Lee Jae-myung campaign of Democratic Party of Korea. Now, Do-yeon, what is the atmosphere there like? We saw the leadership clapping and applauding after this very, very close race of 47.8% for Lee Jae-myung. What's it like?
Right, Kanyang, you saw everyone clapping and cheering, and as the specifics came out as well, they were cheering, and I heard highest cheers when it came to the traditional strongholds where Lee Jae-myung was not leading, but I think they saw the gap was close enough so that they were doing much better than they had expected at traditional strongholds like Busan and Ulsan. Also, I just want to mention that Lee Jae-myung was losing in Seoul, but he was beating Yoon Suk-yeol according to the exit polls in Gyeonggi-do province and Incheon, which had the crowd really happy. Other than that, right now it's a close race, and we've all talked about before. Some of the votes are not considered in this exit poll. So the early votes, which it could go either way, but I think that there are certain expectations that much of the early votes might be coming towards to the ruling Democratic Party of Korea side.
Right. What about Yu Kyung-eun? Our Lee Kyung-eun, of course, is with the main opposition People Power Party's Yoon Suk-yeol campaign. Did we see a tiny bit of disappointment there because the difference is so tiny? Is it smaller than they had anticipated?
Well, I think I'm going to have to say I did feel some sort of disappointment because right after results came out, some party members stood up clapping and I could feel some liveliness. But right after that, as the exit poll results came out for different regions, things have become extremely different. They are now very calm and they're cautiously looking at the results coming out right now. And as you said, the party has been very optimistic about the results. They've been citing the polls they were conducting on their own. And they were, I think, expecting some more of a upper hand looking results for Yoon. But after all, it was an extremely tight race between Lee Jae-myung and Yoon Suk-yeol, as a lot of people have expected. According to polls that were released right before early voting, the time there was the legal cutoff for the polls that were allowed to be published. So I think, after all, it's something that they have expected, but not something what they have been looking forward to. But I think at this point, we're just going to have to wait and see how things actually unfold.
Right, that is correct, and you guys will be updating us on that all throughout the night. Thank you, guys. Now, another very interesting thing is that another network, JTBC here in Korea, did their own exit poll, and their exit poll shows Lee Jae-myung having an upper hand of 48.4%, Yoon Suk-yeol with 47.7%. So this is very interesting. But so those are the two exit polls that we have at this point, and they're very, very they're very, very close, and we will be announcing the early exit polls right now. And yes, there we go. This is the exit poll done by the three major networks here in Korea, the local networks, KBS, MBC, SBS done together. And this exit poll showing Lee Jae-myung of the Democratic Party of Korea with 47.8% and Yoon Suk-yeol of People Power Party 48.8%. But I must add, one done by JTBC, which is another cable network. Now that shows Lee Jae-myung having a slight upper hand of 48.4% and Yoon Suk-yeol with 47.7%. Of course, the rest is taken by third-party candidates, of course. So that is the early exit polls. Another very interesting thing is that another network, JTBC here in Korea, did their own exit poll, and their exit poll shows Lee Jae-myung having an upper hand of 48.4%, Yoon Suk-yeol with 47.7%. So this is very interesting. But so those are the two exit polls that we have at this point, and they're very, very, they're very, very close, and we will be announcing the early exit polls right now. And yes, there we go. This is the exit poll done by the three major networks here in Korea, the local networks, KBS, MBC, SBS done together. And this exit poll showing Lee Jae-myung of the Democratic Party of Korea with 47.8% and Yoon Suk-yeol of People Power Party 48.8%. But I must add, one done by JTBC, which is another cable network. Now that shows Lee Jae-myung having a slight upper hand of 48.4% and Yoon Suk-yeol with 47.7%. Of course, the rest is taken by third-party candidates, of course. So that is the early exit polls. So like we said, we have seen the early exit polls. They're very neck and neck. We have two different set of early exit polls, one done by the three major networks here in Korea, one done by KBS, MBC, SBS, which shows Lee Jae-myung with 47.8%, Yoon Suk-yeol with 48.4%. Another one done by cable network JTBC that has Lee Jae-myung in the lead with 48.4%, Yoon Suk-yeol with 47.7%. Now, having said that, and with this, with an early voting at a record high and 880,000 people with COVID-19 or in quarantine voting after hours, how reliable is this exit poll? Because ever since exit polls were implemented here in Korea, they've never been, it was always right, actually, in previous presidential elections.
Well, it depends on the margin of error, Kan-young, I think, and I'm sure Jiyeon will have some insight on this as well. Any poll will have some sort of an area, a gray area, where there's a statistical tie that's possible. And some polls will have a plus or minus margin of error of about 3% in either direction. Apparently, these polls are a little bit tighter than that, but still, with the two candidates just 1 percentage points apart either direction, we really, could flip that result either way. I mean, I'll tell you one thing though: if the people that are showing up in these exit poll numbers turn out to be representative of the electorate in the country, regardless of who wins the election, we're going to have a divided country. I mean, this is showing us that the voters were very much of different minds and that there may be a split. Both candidates, of course, and we can talk more about this as the night goes on, but Lee Jae-myung and Yoon Suk-yeol have very different prescriptions on where to take the country right now, very different kinds of economic policies. On some things they're similar, but on the economic side they're very different. So I do wonder now, seeing the exit polls so close, if this means that the voters here in Korea are almost split down the middle in terms of where to take the country domestically.
That is exactly what defines this elections. There is a lot of divisions that we're seeing in this country, and especially that's represented in this election. Of course, and as much as there is a very high voter turnout this time around, it's more of voting for the less unlikable than voting for who you like, and that could be a problem. And there's been a lot of issues that arose, such as gender equality or a lot of different feminism issues. And what are some issues that Ji-yeon, that really was brought into the spotlight because of this campaign?
No, there are a lot of scandals, but one of them I can say for sure is the family troubles. One of the main leak of the 7 hours phone conversations of a reporter of Kim Gun-hee, the wife of Yoon Suk-yeol. As you mentioned, gender issues have struck a chord, as Kim's comments revealed that she suggested that the hashtag #MeToo victims have ulterior motives. She seemed like she's siding with their perpetrators. So on the other hand, we have Lee Jae-myung's wife Kim Hye-kyung apologizing a few weeks ago over allegations that she misused public servants while her husband was a governor, and she misused corporate cards during her husband's term as the governor of Gyeonggi province. So there are these scandals, as you mentioned, unfavorables, and people would not like to have a president that have scandals and these schemes and shortcuts that the president's wives, the first family have to be a role model in this country. In any other countries, and having these scandals before you're elected and during the campaign trail, there are bits and pieces along the campaign trail that's not clearly addressed. This is one of the dirtiest election that I've ever witnessed.
Nastiest, I agree with you, Ji-yeon, on that. One of the foreign media outlets, in fact, described this very election as a Squid Game race. It's a win or die. Would you agree with that?
Well, we just don't know which set of issues drove voters. Was it that the voters, when they showed up, were they, just to follow up Ji-yeon's point about the scandals, and yes, both candidates are kind of distasteful. So did the voters this time around just throw ideology and throw public policy issues out the window, and they went to the polls and just picked whichever candidate seemed less distasteful for them, and that's the one that's going to survive, and the one that's more distasteful is going to die in their minds? Or, were there did they try to look beyond all that? Did the voters just decide, well, the scandals cancel these two candidates out, so we can't, both of their spouses, of course, are enmeshed in scandal, and there's lots of other financial scandals and corruption scandals and so forth. And, both candidates have been compared to Donald Trump at different times for the crudeness and so forth. So did the voters put that aside and finally vote on policy differences? And, that's the part we don't yet know.
Right. I think, in the final couple of days into the campaigning, the scandals actually canceled themselves out. And it was actually, I would say, less of the policies, but the personalities, the personalities themselves of each candidate that people focused on. And that we'll have to wait and see and find out. Right. So various policy agendas and various tasks waiting for the new administration. Now, I want to go back to the voter turnout, as our Yoon Jung-min just explained to us. So the highest voter turnout was back in 1997, and she did say that it was at 80.7%. That was when Kim Dae-jung was elected president. Now, so ever since then, this time is the highest voter turnout. What can we make out of that?
Yeah, so interesting, isn't it? And in 2007, the Lee Myung-bak victory that year, I saw the voter turnout on that chart was quite low. And that was at a time when the economy was doing quite well here overall. Although I remember there was some dissatisfaction at that point with the direction of the country as well, which led to the change in political party in the Blue House that election. But the stock market, for instance, during that time was riding high. There was no pandemic. There was a sense that East Asia was a really rising engine of the world economy going into the new century. Well, now the century is no longer new. East Asia is still very much an economic engine, but it's in some ways, I mean, Korea has become a little bit more like Japan in terms of becoming a slow growth economy now compared to, say, 10 to 20 years ago. So I think there is a lot of uncertainty about the economic prospects of this country. Just look at the exchange rate going into the election this time as well. It's a much weaker exchange rate with that high turnout election this year than we had with the 2007 election, when I think it was more $1 to 1,000 won. Now we're at about $1 to what, 12.35 won. So yes, I mean, the public, I think, is looking for answers. We just heard also one of the commentaries about how economic revitalization is what the public is looking for post-pandemic. And I think that means something bigger than just, helping small businesses get back on their feet again after COVID-19. That's looking for a new approach that seems to have eluded the past 3 administrations over the past 12 years since the global financial crisis. So some challenges ahead.
Right. And another interesting thing to note is that every 10 years, there have been a regime change or administrative change in terms of the ruling Democratic Party and the Conservative Party. So conservatives and the liberals have been, going back and forth, the Blue House, every 10 years. If Yoon Suk-yeol were to take the Blue House this time around, he would be breaking that equation as well. Now, if that were to happen, would that mean something else for this country? Would that mean that ideology means less for this generation of South Koreans?
Yeah, I mean, this would be a 5-year rotation in the Blue House instead of a 10-year rotation.
Yeah.
That's something that I've really thought about a lot. And I almost expected in 2017, even if Park Geun-hye hadn't gone down in that spectacular scandal that led to her impeachment with Moon Jae-in winning so overwhelmingly. I think even before that scandal, the public sentiment was shifting very much in favor of the DP. Even the assembly election before the 2017 presidential race was showing a real change in the tide. But in some ways, both political parties seem to gravitate toward a center, and I think both political parties are somewhat captive to the forces of the global marketplace, too. I mean, we haven't really seen any radical changes in direction in economic policy from either political party. The J-balls are still intact. The national health insurance is still intact. We still have a little bit of social democracy in Korea in some respects. We have aspects of, just a radical free market economy in other aspects, and dissatisfaction with that does seem to be mounting. And again, that would be a sign that there's both dissatisfaction and also disagreement on how to resolve this sort of economic doldrums that we might be in. That 5-year rotation could keep going until there's a new formula that can satisfy the public for another decade.
Right. Another very interesting thing to note is that a lot of the younger voters, we had anticipated or expected these younger voters to gravitate towards third-party candidates. Surprisingly, we didn't see much of that happen, well, based on these early exit polls. What can we make out of that? What are you reading into that?
I mean, like I said, the coalition between Yoon Suk-yeol and Ahn Cheol-soo was a really big key element here. We have to see whether that led to more voters to Lee Jae-myung or Yoon Suk-yeol. But I looked at Yoon Jung-min's report earlier, and I noticed that Gwangju and Jeollam, the provinces, has one of the highest voter turnouts this year, which, traditionally they are left-leaning, which is good for Lee Jae-myung, but these areas are less populated than when compared to the capital region or other, like Busan, one of the second highly populated cities. So we have to wait and see whether these voter turnout is actually swinging for Lee Jae-myung or Yoon Suk-yeol. And these younger voters, they're, traditionally in Korea, rather than addressing these core policy issues, like you said, rather than platforms, personality is a really important issue and traditionally in South Korean election, and has been driven elections in South Korea because of historically weak party systems in Korea. And this has a lot of play in the turnout in my opinion. So rather than, when you look at the core policy issues, the candidates have focused on appealing to voters with populist proposals like cash handouts, which is understandable in the pandemic. But, there's not a clear line as to whether whoever we pick, our lives or our livelihoods will be significantly better. We can't see that in the policy issues.
So we are going to be back here at midnight. Do you think by then we will have a rough idea of who the winner will be?
Well, if that exit polling is any indication, and if the early voting totals turn out to be somewhat similar, then the exit polling, however that's counted, and if the exit polling turns out to be accurate, we could be here for a very long time, and I think we might not know by midnight. I think we might not even know by 3 a.m. how the election is going to resolve. Could be a long time, but that's just a guess.
So we have a long, long night ahead. Well, thank you, Professor Han Shuttle, for that. We will see you back here at midnight, and of course, Ji-yeon, you'll be back here with me as well. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kanya.